Can everyone see that? Amazing. So I'm really so thrilled to be here to discuss my two favorite topics, prison industrial complex abolition and Yiddishkayt. Just so that we're all on the same page, I'll borrow from seminal abolitionist organizing group Critical Resistance to define prison industrial complex abolition as a political vision with the goal of eliminating imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, and creating lasting alternatives to punishment and imprisonment. To explore the space where Yiddishkayt and abolition converge, I'll focus on the Yiddish-Russian song Daloy Politsey, literally translating to "Down with the Police." To deepen the definition of abolition that I initially introduced, I turn to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who theorizes abolition as life in rehearsal. In other words, an abolitionist future is not a far-off endpoint. It is made and remade at the level of our everyday actions and relations. The present and the future converge in a process of simultaneous destruction and creation. On first glance, Daloy Politsey appears to be a song squarely about destruction. In the 1921 folkloric songbook, Arbeit und Freiheit, collected by Shmuel Lehman as one of the first written documentations of Daloy Politsey, the chorus, "Hey, hey, Daloy Politsey, Daloy Zamadержavet Frasey," or "Hey, hey, down with the police, down with the Russian ruling class," is interspersed with rhyming couplets brainstorming different means by which to depose of the Tsar and to annihilate the carceral infrastructure that upholds the Tsar's regime. Let's break down little Nicholas's walls. Let's bury little Nicholas with his mother. Let's shoot down the barracks. Let's make the prisons burn. But I want to propose through this presentation that Daloy Politsey is not just a song about destruction. It is and has been taken up as a world-building practice of abolitionist life in rehearsal. Firstly, if we look more deeply into the lyrics, we can see what is being created through destruction. In each verse, before they assert a vision of destruction, the singers describe how they will do it, namely through solidarity, community, and relationships. Lo mir gehen zusammen, let's go together, or lo mir sich geben die Hand, let's go hand in hand, or lo mir werden Revolutionarien, let's become revolutionaries. One variant in the Lehman songbook goes, Schwester und Brüder, lo mir machen die Fisch. Now, perhaps this line about making the fish was just a random phrase thrown out for the sake of setting up a rhyme couplet, but I read it as a reminder of the centrality of feminized labor, in this case, the cooking, but also the cleaning, the child rearing, etc., that it takes to propel a revolution, the generative, creative work of reproducing the revolution. But to understand how Daloy Politsey is a work of creation, a practice of abolitionist life in rehearsal, we must look beyond the song itself to understand how the process of making, singing, and transmitting the song has opened space to practice anti-carceral ways of being and relating. In ways that most top-down political historiographies cannot, the musical practice of Yiddish radicals provides a window into the lives, beliefs, and theoretical contributions of the everyday people who comprise radical organizing formations like the Jewish Labor Bund. Not beholden to the control of an executive committee, each echo of Daloy Politsey is a product of the autonomy, improvisation, and affective lives of the choral of voices who join together to create the song in the midst of their collective struggle. In other words, collective singing is an act of world-making. And as I hope Daloy Politsey's path will illuminate, studying Yiddish cultural work, at its core, is the study of relationship. Daloy Politsey did not move across space and time on its own. Rather, its passage was propelled through kinship networks, mentorship, friendship, and caring archival stewardship. So as this presentation moves along, I'll expand on how the relations cultivated through the transmission of Daloy Politsey are the site of this world-making work in the way they enliven new conceptions of collective safety, internationalist solidarity, and generational connections. So where did Daloy Politsey come from? And why did these Jewish radicals long for a world without police? It's difficult to pin down the exact origin because Daloy Politsey has been constantly made and remade by activists in the streets, at dining room tables, in union choirs, at punk shows, and on pandemic Zoom sing-alongs. The earliest mention of Daloy Politsey that I've encountered in my archival research comes from 1906, and given that the General Jewish Labor Bund, within whose circles the song originated, came together as a formal organizing formation in 1897, I would approximate that Daloy Politsey emerged sometime within this 9-year period. The Jewish Music Research Center estimates that it was first collected around 1905, and the lyrics of the song certainly match the revolutionary fervor of this moment. To set the scene a bit, in 1905, the Russian streets ignited with masses of workers demanding the overthrow of the Tsar and the dismantling of the Russian ruling class and the structures and forces that upheld it, one of these forces being the police. But these waves of revolutionary protests in 1905 did not simply erupt spontaneously. Rather, they reflect the deep and deliberate organizing of political formations like the Bund, who had been engaging in the long and careful work of cultivating revolutionary socialist political consciousness, stewarding radical Yiddish cultural production, and critically building relationships and bonds of solidarity amongst both Bundists and with the broader Russian working class. Perhaps the mix of Russian and Yiddish in the lyrics tells us something about these relationships. As an illegal group for much of its lifespan, the Bund did all this work under conditions of intense and violent repression by the Russian and military and police state. So I would argue that the character of the Bund in Russia was deeply shaped by policing. By this, I do not mean that the Russian Bund was defined by their experiences of police repression, but rather by what they created in excess of it. In other words, the constant threat of police violence that precluded access to conventional channels of political organizing compelled Bundists to forge new ways of being that articulated and enacted possibilities for alternative modes of political and social relations. Knowing that the police or the Tsar state would never be a source of safety, they had to find safety within each other. We see this in the self-defense networks organized by the Bund and its co-conspirators, in the face of the Tsarist regime's escalating anti-Semitic and counterinsurgent violence, with police often at the front lines of these attacks, Jewish radicals and their comrades banded together to front a coordinated resistance and to build a sense of safety rooted in collective solidarity. As prolific abolitionist thinker Miriam Kaba reiterates, safety is not a thing that can be possessed. It is a relationship that is made. So I wish to provocate how looking at these radical Yiddish communities who understood police power as fundamentally oppositional to their safety opens imaginative space to think about how we build relationships of safety in an abolitionist world without police. These are the conditions that birthed a song like Daloy Politsey. Through migration and communication channels across borders and states, Daloy Politsey soon emerged in radical Jewish circles in the early 20th century United States. The Ruth Rubin Sound Archive at YIVO holds a field recording from Bessie Ducks. Bessie's family came from Russia to the United States in 1906, and she reminisces about singing Daloy Politsey at parties her family would throw in their Jewish anarchist circles to raise funds to free Russian prisoners from Siberia. Bessie's version goes, Nächten hat gefiert a Wegele Mach, heint is geworden Victor Bloch, or yesterday he pushed a wagon full of moss, today he has become Victor Bloch. Victor Bloch being the exploitative factory owner who employed many of the workers in Bessie's cousin's town. So we can already see how Yiddish radicals across space are enlivening and adapting Daloy Politsey to fit the particularities of their political conditions, while at the same time forging an analytical through line across geographic space, united by their shared desire to say, down with the police. As Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us, abolition must be international. In this vein, I propose that the resonance of Daloy Politsey across borders allows us to better understand policing as a globally connected system. It is not to say that policing is the same in different political contexts. For example, we must always place anti-Blackness at the center of an analysis of policing in the United States. It is instead to highlight the common underlying function of police to discipline and contain the underclass and enforce the boundaries of capital, property, and whiteness. The internationalism forged through the transmission of Daloy Politsey is abolitionist life in rehearsal because it disarticulates the nation state as a legitimate ordering category of life, land, and relationality. It builds modes of resistance and social relations that refuse to be disciplined by borders, which is, of course, deeply connected to a Bundist Yiddishkayt as a product of non-territorial cultural autonomy and diasporism. Going in the wrong direction. We looked at the transmission of Daloy Politsey across space a little bit, and now I want to look at the transmission of Daloy Politsey across time. So of course, these are interconnected and nonlinear processes. In my research in the archives, I noticed a significant surge of engagement with Daloy Politsey around the 1960s, the late 1960s and 70s. While not as present during and after the Second World War, Daloy Politsey remains stored in the embodied memory and kinship networks of the people who experienced it. And this stewardship allowed the song to take on new lives as it was engaged, both to commemorate the radicalism of the past and to enliven a future for Yiddish anti-police, anti-fascist, anti-capitalist thinking and organizing. Daloy Politsey formally re-entered the Yiddish cultural lexicon in 1957, when it appeared in an Arbiter Ring record called Amol is Gevena Maisa, which sought to tell the story of Jewish life in Eastern Europe through a compilation of songs. Joseph Molotek, a collaborator on this record, probably learned Daloy Politsey in the streets through his involvement in Bundes youth circles in Warsaw in the 1920s and 30s. And he passed the song down to his son, Zalman Molotek, who helped facilitate the revival of Daloy Politsey amongst young Jews politicized in the growing radicalism of the 70s. Zalman taught Daloy Politsey to many children as the music director of Camp Hemshech and helped create the 1971 Bundes youth record, Yiddish Songs of Work and Struggle, which featured Daloy Politsey. Daloy Politsey is a radical song. It makes its demand with no ambiguity, down with the police, down with the ruling class. So it makes sense that it resonated amongst the growing leftist militancy of the 70s. But there's another reason why I think Daloy Politsey struck a chord with radical Jews in the 70s. This moment marked the beginning of explosive prison expansion and the emergence of the tough on-crime ethos that continuously ensnared more people, especially Black folks and political radicals, into the grasp of the violent carceral state. Many Jewish radicals were, like their ancestors, confronting police in the streets, and some were also organizing in solidarity with Black radicals who had deeply understood the fundamental violence of policing. Thus, Daloy Politsey was not just taken up as a commemoration of a bygone time. Instead, these activists injected new life into the song as a response to the crisis of policing in their contemporary material conditions. The tradition of enlivening Daloy Politsey to respond to the present has continued through the 90s and into the 21st century. Jews for Racial and Economic Justice sang the song to protest police killings of Amadou Diallo in 1999 and Eric Garner in 2014. And in the wake of the 2020 uprisings for racial justice, abolitionist Jews across the world now have posters on their walls that overlay the phrase Daloy Politsey with the letters FTP, for Fuck the Police, that were sold to raise funds for Palestine solidarity movements. And they're also sporting Daloy Politsey tote bags from the queer anarchist Yiddish cafe Di Rosa Pave. New recordings and reimaginations of Daloy Politsey by artists like Jeff Berner, Brivala, and Isabel Frey have allowed the song's reach to travel farther and wider, and they further solidify Daloy Politsey's position as a living piece of Yiddish cultural production. The cross-generational transmission of Daloy Politsey holds great possibilities for abolitionist life and rehearsal. Not only does the passage of the song happen through relationship, but also the connection between the past and the present is an important site of relationality itself. Mainstream historiographies are deeply invested in upholding a teleological narrative of history as a linear march towards progress, and part of this work is to fragment social movement histories, to make each eruption of the struggle against oppression seem like a new distinct thing, separate from the movements before it, in order to obscure the fact that oppressive structures are perpetuating, molding, and adapting across historical conditions. And so too is the resistance to them. We see this today as the abolition movement often gets framed as totally new and therefore radically fringe and naive in its theoretical orientation. So when we situate ourselves in a long lineage of Yiddish radicals who have been imagining, demanding, and building a world without police since 1905 and before, we are doing the critical generative work of making a deep historical genealogy of abolition undeniably legitimate. In the spirit of relational genealogies, I want to end the presentation by sharing a bit about how I learned about Daloy Politsey by way of a word of gratitude to the folks who have lent their wisdom on this project. This research has truly been a collective endeavor, so I want to express gratitude to Rosa Ling-Lesvitsky, Misha Holub, and Joe Isaac from De Rosa Pave, Josh Waletsky, Jeff Berner, Stephanie Brenler, Maya Brown from the band Bruvela, Dalma Malotek, and all of the Jewish radicals, past and present, whose organizing and thinking created the political and theoretical grounds for this work. And I'll just conclude on a question that I would love for us all to think about, which is, in our movement of Yiddish radicalism today, how are we rehearsing modes of being that prefigure a world beyond the prison industrial complex? Thank you so much.